Welcome, everybody. The Center for the Study of Tennesseans in War is formed to gather the stories of people in our region who have been involved in conflict over the last 300 years. And we're privileged to preserve those stories and get those stories out to the world. And we're honored today to have Captain William Robinson here with us, someone that I consider to be an American hero, someone whose service I value, and someone who the nation should value. When you think to yourself, how much would you suffer for your nation? Would you be willing to suffer a week, a month? Some of us remember at the start of COVID, people were complaining about having to wear masks for a week. Imagine being a prisoner of war for over 7 years. That's the person that we have with us today. President Nixon also made you a lieutenant, if I'm not wrong about that.
That's correct.
Also won a number of awards over the course of his career and retired a captain.
Yes.
And is also now living in Tennessee and has been living here for a number of years.
15 plus years.
15 plus years. He's a Tennessean in our book, and we're happy to have him.
Well, I try to remind folks that Tennessee used to belong to North Carolina, and so therefore I was born and raised in North Carolina, so therefore I was born and raised in Tennessee.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, and that's where I wanted to start. Thank you very much. When were you born? Where were you born? And can you tell us about that place?
Yeah, I was born in a little cotton mill town in eastern North Carolina, right on the Roanoke River, 6 miles south of Virginia. I guess the easy way to describe it is 6 miles south of Virginia border on I-95.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a mill village. They had 5 cotton mills and 1 paper mill, and these are kind of the first group of people that moved off the farms, and my grandfather was one of those that moved off the farm and moved into Roanoke Rapids and started his career as working at a cotton mill at the age of 16, and that's just come from. I didn't know I was poor until I left home. Somebody told me about it, you know, because I was blessedly surrounded with love, and that's the richest thing you can have.
That's right.
Money is not a monetary thing, you know. Yeah. It's just not the thing that we grow off of.
That's right. Love is real wealth.
It is absolutely.
And your parents, what did they do?
My dad was essentially. He was a jack of all trades and master of none. He had ventured into different things. He spent 6 years in the Army. You know, he got drafted right at the end of World War II and continued his career for a while. And in fact, his claim to fame is he made private first class 3 times in his 6 years in the military. So you know that he probably wasn't on the best graces when he left. And of course, another war coming on, so it was time to go home and be with the family.
Yep. And did his experience influence your interest in the military or desire to enlist?
Well, I didn't quite understand it. I guess the influence of my total family. My grandfather gave up 2 sons for World War II, and they both survived. And you know, his siblings gave up another 5 or 6. So you know, I was surrounded by military, and then I grew up in an era where I don't think I ever went to church. There wasn't someone sitting there in a uniform that had served their country. So it was common for us at that particular time and you know, they had the opportunity to tell me that someday that would be my responsibility to serve my country, and I always look forward to it rather than being a dread. In fact, I think the strongest influence was my grandfather. When I tell the story of when I was about 8 or 9 years old, back in World War II, they didn't have a national monument to honor prisoners of war and those who served, but each little town had a wall, and I call it, and my grandfather, when he thought I was old enough to understand, took me down to that wall, and as I stood there, I'm looking at this great big wall. It's with plexiglass front, and next to it is a beautiful American flag. And as I described, I just sat there, and all I could see was name after name after name. And then my grandfather started talking, and he started to bring those names to life.
Yeah.
And the first thing he talked about, was when our country came under attack in 1941, that these are the people in my neighborhood that raised their right hand and said, "Take me, I want to defend America." And, and some of them lied about their age, and both male and female, and some of them were father and son, some of them were brother and brother, and they just wanted to serve their country.
Yeah.
And I learned about the people in my neighborhood that I'd seen get up every morning, go to work, and never thought of them ever donning the uniform. And of course, that time, but I got some of their stories, and as we were talking, that I noticed that some of the names had stars beside it. And and I asked my grandfather what the star stood for, and kind of with a lump in his throat and a tear in his eyes, he said, "They're the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice for freedoms that we enjoy every day." And and one of them was the boy across the street that grew up with my brother, with my dad and my uncle. And he was one of a set of twins, and and he didn't come home from war, but there's just, that's, like I said, there was only 50 steps from my house to where he lived, and
Yeah.
and that's how close I realized the war had been to this small community that I lived in.
Touched a lot of people, a lot of communities. Do you mentioned people lying about their age. Do you remember what age you were when you enlisted, and what year that was?
I graduated from high school at 17, and I could not enlist on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And so I refused to allow my father or my stepmother to sign for me to join the service. I just didn't want to tax them with that burden. So the day I turned 18, I signed up for the draft and went straight to the recruiter's office.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt like it was time for me to get the hell out of Dodge.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
that was 1961.
And in 1961, and was that an Air Force recruiting office that you
Air
entered?
Force.
And why Air
See,
Force?
Well, we had different scenarios. I could volunteer for the draft and be drafted. I could, have a 3-year tour. Or I could, but I was looking for a career at that particular point. I knew I wasn't college material, and wasn't no sense in shade my eyes with that. So I decided that, and I went down, and I think my brother-in-law, who was in the Air Force, kind of convinced me that the Air Force was a better deal. I looked at the Marine Corps, but it didn't take me long to see that they got muddy. And so, I went, and that's when I found out the realization. I went and talked to the recruiter, and, like I said, that he said, "When do you want to go in?" I said, "Tomorrow." I just give me a chance to get some time. But he conned me, and he said, "I'd like for you to make sure you get what you want." Said, "How about November?" I said, "Well, if I'm going to have to wait till November, why don't I just wait till January?" Well, it turned out basically he had filled his quota for September, October, and January, so he wanted me for November, and so I left. I was so excited that I went the week before Thanksgiving and flunked the physical, and
You failed your physical.
I failed the physical.
Yeah.
I could have took my 4F and just walked away, but that wasn't in the cards. So I went back the next week and passed the physical, and I arrived at Lackland Air Force Base on Thanksgiving morning, 1961.
Okay. And after basic training, where did you go?
At that time, basic training was two different ways. If you were going to be farmed out to a base, you would complete 8 weeks of training at Lackland, and then farm out to a base, and they would put you where they needed you. But since I was going to helicopter maintenance school, then I finished 5 weeks at Lackland and then went to Shepherd Air Force Base and completed training there, and simultaneously where we spent the last our 3 weeks of remaining on basic training. We did that over about a 12-week period along with going to school. So we would go to school half a day and go to finish a basic military training in the afternoon or morning, depending on what session you were in. The schools run from 6 to 6, you know, so my schedule was from 6 to 12, and then finishing basic training from 1 to 3, basically.
Yeah. Now, helicopter maintenance.
Yeah.
What got you into helicopters? Helicopters are cool.
Well,
You don't have to sell me on it, but I'm just curious what got you into helicopters.
I was just looking for aircraft maintenance,
Yeah.
and it just happened that they needed.
Why
helicopter-
maintenance, Bill? Have you always liked to work on
I like to
stuff?
work with my
Yeah.
hands. You know, I'm
Yep.
more interested in, you know. I used to had a sign on the back of my car that said I'm mechanically inclined. I can screw up anything, you know, and that's but I just, you know, my dad did shade tree mechanics in the backyard. My granddaddy did, and that was when the neighborhood was getting up going fishing at 6 o'clock in the morning. They were getting up and go work on their car or whatever, you know, and I was underneath there and sharing the grease with them, you know.
Yep. Now, I'm sure some folks want to know about the technical aspects of the helicopters that you worked on. Were they relatively easy, like an old truck to fix up and repair, or were these high-tech pieces of equipment that took you a bit?
Well, I think the first week we trained on a Bridge and Stratton 4-cycle engine. Basically, everything starts from the ground up. I mean, the principles are still the same. I say that's one of the problems we have today when we think about alternate energy. You can't name anything that's nearly 200 years old that we still use except the gasoline engine.
Yeah.
And you know, it's that to me is the interesting part. And then you built from there. And like I said, when I went through tech school, we didn't have any electronics other than a gauge.
Mhm.
You know, nothing sophisticated like we have now. And so we trained in 2 different ways as both the maintenance, and we were flight engineers also. So we had a double rated, you might say, as far as. But now it takes about, 3 of them to do the same job I was doing because of the electronics on board.
Yeah.
You know, it takes 2 to operate the electronics and 1 to remove and replace. You know, true mechanics is, it has to go back to the depot for that. Everything on the line is done with a push and pull.
Mhm.
Push this one out and put another one in there. That's basically, it's everything is electronic today compared to getting out there with a filler gauge and, and adjusting a rod or something. It's all done electronically.
Yeah.
A button here and a button there.
Yeah.
Everything.
So you did your basic training, then you went and into helicopter maintenance. Where did you go again, and where?
Okay, well, like I said,
and
somewhere in the process, they brought in a dream sheet, and
yes.
my brother-in-law had
Yes.
just come back from Alaska, so I volunteered for Alaska, thinking that'd be a great place to go to get.
Alaska. You wanted to go to Alaska.
I wanted to go to Alaska.
You got a
But,
bit of an adventure streak in there.
Yeah, a little bit, and
Yeah.
then when the assignment came down, 3 of my classmates went to Alaska, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma, which is 45 miles up the road, just across the Red River from where I was. And they were at that time they were thinking about giving us a remote tour because we were so far from.
Yeah. And what did you do there?
Well, I guess I couldn't have got any lower on the totem pole. This is a B-52 wing that had Atlas missile wing had moved in, and they were putting the Atlas missile sites all over west Oklahoma and northwest, northeast, northwest, and where you want to get Texas, And the helicopters were bought there for maintenance purposes to expedite maintenance once these missile sites come up and running. You may take 3 hours by road to get a part out to a missile site, and where they could do it in 15 minutes with a helicopter. And that was good, except the engineers didn't get together, so the helipads for the helicopters were built too close to the silo opening, so we couldn't land. We had to head out in the field between the fences, to accommodate them. But that was our main job, and of course we were assigned to the B-52 wing in base flight, and base flight was basically took care of all transit airplanes that come into the base, and so I got the pleasure of working on airplanes and doing a little transit alert work on different airplanes that flew into the base that was our responsibility. And so we all became certified in refueling, not heavy maintenance, but light maintenance, like wiping the airplane down and things like that. And
I can sense that you enjoyed that work.
Oh yeah.
Did you prefer working on airplanes to helicopters?
No,
Just like it all.
What I liked about helicopters, they were normally home at night.
Okay.
An airplane you might take off, and you may or may not get home. It's kind of like an over-the-road truck driver, and where nobody else could take care of us. The other bases were not set up to take care of helicopters. All they could do was give us fuel and send us on our way. And so that was.
So how long were you in Oklahoma then?
Well, it's back then the level of power was there was SAC, and then there was the Air Force, and the SAC ran the Air Force, and of course that was because General LeMay was head of SAC, and when the Air Force came into being, he became the chief of staff. But his mentality was. So we all had to be SAC-massaged, to be able to work there, and like I said, they told us that when you got there, you either probably would die or retire right here at Altus, and I fooled them. In 18 months, I had an assignment to Korea, because what had happened is Air Force and its management, we ended up getting 2 airplanes, and we had 36 people to maintain 2 airplanes. So we got farmed out doing everything, and next thing you know, they got us all farmed out, and then they sent the airplanes. And the week I left to go to Korea, we had 6 airplanes and 7 people. So when I left, we were down to 6.
Yeah.
And so.
How did that come about, Bill? How did you go from Oklahoma to Korea?
Just time to go. I was just going from one remote tour to another.
Okay.
And I said they were just farming us out. Like I said, some of them went to Idaho, and some of them went to Montana.
And they just sent you to Korea.
And just sent me to Korea.
They just said, "Bill, you're going to Korea."
Yes,
what did you think about going overseas to Korea?
I had no problem with it. I mean, I definitely didn't want to spend the rest of my life in Oklahoma. Like I said, I tried to join one of the tribes out there, but they wouldn't let me.
What about your family, Bill? What did they think about you? Are you writing letters back home?
Well, my mother died when I was 15, and my dad finally married his girlfriend after my mother died, and we didn't have the greatest relationship. We tried to keep peace in the family, and but
Siblings?
I had 2 sisters, one older and one younger.
Did you write to them?
Not really.
Okay, you're off in Oklahoma doing your thing.
And we can make contact every once in a while, hi and bye, and and never bothered to ask for money, because they didn't have any to share with you, or if there's any asking, it was them. Hey, can we borrow this? That? But they did help me get a car, and we got the car there, and about 3 months later I had an assignment,
So how did you get to Korea?
Courtesy of the United States government. They got this transportation service, they offer, and
Shipped over across the Pacific?
Yeah, and I had to make my way to San Francisco, and once I got to San Francisco, we were on a chartered flight some of us got off in Japan, and some went on to Korea, and it was just, it's like stepping back about 300 years from what we were familiar with, as far as going backwards. I mean, it's not taking anything away from them. It's just that, Korea had been in a war, and they were still recovering from a war 10 years later, and Korea was, like I said, it was a mere shadow of itself. It only had one main road from Seoul to the South Korea Peninsula. It was just, everything had been destroyed.
And do you remember what year it was when you came to Korea?
I left in August and went home in August of '63, and then left in September of '63, going to Korea, arriving there, late September '63, and stayed there until November of '64.
Now, how aware were you at that point of world events?
Well, I tell folks when I came back, I was well aware, because I came into service a year after the Bay of Pigs, and in the break room, I listened to these old codgers who talked about Bay of Pigs and what a screw up it was. Basically, it boils down to communication. The left hand wasn't talking to the right hand wasn't talking to anybody, the Army wasn't coordinating with the Air Force, and the Navy wasn't coordinating with anybody, and the president, even one president, said, "I'm leaving, you got it," and he didn't even give the Kennedy the proper briefing on the Bay of Pigs and what was going on, and then it was an action put in place before Kennedy. That's the reason I've always reminded him, even though it was planned and almost executed, not under his watch, but I mean, he was in charge, but he owned up to it.
What about domino theory? What about fears of communism? Were you kind of aware of all of that, and did that kind of shape your attitudes toward military service in the '60s?
Well, my objective was that I always felt that the military's job was to defend our country, foreign and domestic, and I always wanted to be a part of that, and I realized that everybody that's in the military doesn't carry a weapon. There's one hell of a support group that makes it all come together, but when, like I said, I was on active duty during Cuban Missile Crisis, and I saw communication play an important role in the 72 hours of finding out the missiles on Cuban soil. They were being boxed up and removed, unlike what's going on today, where, how many are you going to bring? Okay, we just bring them on over. Maybe you can send them over to America for R&R, and we love to have Chinese over here.
Yeah. And so you saw your military service as part of that larger fight.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when I was in Korea, the president was assassinated, and 2 years to the day of me joining the service. And I was very grateful for being around the World War II and the Korean War veterans. Both, some had served in the Army Air Corps, some had served in the Army and got out and came in the Air Force in different circumstances. But they were there. They were the cool heads around. Where we young people were running around like a chicken with a head cut off. Let's just go kill. And we're kind of like sports squad. Let's just kill them all like God sorted them out. And so that was, the things that I had faced in my first 3 years in the military,
What sorts of things did you do in Korea? Are you still working on helicopters
still
and airplanes?
working on helicopters,
Okay.
and our main mission was, our general on base was, it was a backup for the Army general for any of the negotiations that took place on the 38th parallel, and so we had to have an airplane prepared at any moment to load the general on and fly him up to the DMZ to meet with our counterparts from the north, and so, you know, I was very aware, you might say, of what was going on, you know, as far as one side and the other.
Yep.
And, you know, and, but
Were,
that
were
was
you
all-
were you nervous about what the North Koreans were doing or might do while you were stationed
Well,
there?
I'm just a confident person
Mm.
that I serve in the greatest military force in the world, and I'm backed by the greatest country on earth. So, you know, might say that, as we say down south, I was walking in tall cotton, you know, and and you know, I just never. I guess at 22 years old, or 21, or 19, you're invincible.
Yep.
You know, you don't, you know, 60 years old was so far away you never even thought about it.
Yep. Yep.
You know, and when they get ready to take off on the airplane, you know, like I said, you know, you made the pilot good. That's another good thing about helicopters. You make the pilot feel good. The same guy that works on it is willing to jump on it, you know, and go with it. You know, so that kind of gives him a little bit better feeling of what he's driving. You know, you might say. And
Yep. And what about camaraderie, Bill? The people that you served with over there in Korea, make some good friends, I imagine.
we were very close
Yeah.
when we were there. You know, and it's, you know, the major can probably explain to you. You know, like I said, that we all get close, but it's a sense of competition, even though the enlisted as his officers. You know, I'm gonna make him look good, but I want to look better, you know, and this sort of thing. So, you know, you just got this, you know, and so you're a lot of times you're competing for the same stripe, you know, and so, you know, you know, you hope to think that you're working together for the better of everybody, but you know, you want to put that extra 10% in for you, so you look good, you know. You kind of like going to the doctor and I'm telling him I feel like crap, and he says, "Well, you look good on paper," you know. I said, "What?"
Yeah.
I said,
I know what that's about. Yeah.
I said, can you explain that to my body? He said,
Yeah,
"No,
right.
that's your job."
So how long were you in Korea?
It's a 13-month tour.
Okay.
And so, you know, again, I tell the story that before I got there, I think it's something that has stuck with me all my life, or since I was, and in August of 1963, when I was getting ready just before my 20th birthday, I went in and there was a crusty old staff sergeant sitting there, and he hardly looked up for a moment, and he says, "Airman, sit down." So I sat down, you know, and then he stood up and he looked at me. He says, "It's something you need to know." I said, "Okay." He said, he explained to me that this was going to be my first experience overseas, and
This is in Korea, and he's
no,
telling you about.
this is in Altus, Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
Of
Talking
course.
about Korea. Gotcha.
Talking about
Gotcha.
Korea.
Yeah.
And he said, "Airman," he said, "I want you to remember, when you go, you represent yourself, you represent your family, you represent the United States Air Force, but most of all, going into a foreign country, you represent the United States of America, and act accordingly." And those words have always stuck with me, that I don't know whether it was part of a briefing or just something that he dreamed up to send this young man in the right direction. But I've always been grateful for that. In fact, sometimes in a speech I'll use it and say, "I wish Jane Fonda had got that briefing."
Amen. And so you're in Korea for 13 months.
Yeah.
And then what happens when those 13 months are up?
Well, somewhere around the 6th or 7th month, they call you in and they give you one of these, again, I call dream sheets. And I was really smart at that time, I thought. You know, I just wrote "Anywhere USA" on it. And of course, I found out that got me in the chief's office pretty quick. And that's when I learned about statistics, you know. And of course, And I went back and did a little research, and that's what Will Rogers said in 1934. There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. And so anyway, he sat down and said, well, you know, you're coming off a remote tour. And I reminded him of two of them because I'd been in Oklahoma and Southwest. And so anyway, he said, you know, you got a 95% chance of getting the area you want. And then he said, the base you want? He said, you got about a 90%, or state you want, you got about a 90% chance of getting the state you want. And said, you know, coming off a remote career, you got about an 85% chance of getting your base preference, especially as a E4. And so with his guiding hand, I filled out my dream sheet for Seymour Johnson in North Carolina. Florida was my state of choice that had more helicopters than any other state. And the area of choice, Southeast. And so I patiently waited for my assignment. Meanwhile, the chief rotated back to states, and my assignment came in as Grand Forks, North Dakota. So I knew that the Air Force and I were working hand in hand to make sure everything went. And when I arrived in North Dakota, they said, oh, did you get the word that the base is closing? You need to think about where you'd like to go from here. And so, of course, you know, at that time I was thinking about just going to the house and starting over, you know, because I had already been accepted to Newport News Shipyard and Dry Dock as in the maintenance department over there. And
You were thinking about getting out, and you were thinking about moving on with your life in the
just,
shipyard.
just momentarily.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then, of course, I got overcome with events. This was in December of '64, and there was I had a couple of job offers. You know, I could go to the VIP flight in Washington D.C., which really didn't interest me, even though it was only a couple of 100 miles from home there at Andrews. And then they said, oh, by the way, Southeast Asia. At that particular time, we didn't even refer to it as Vietnam. It was just Southeast Asia, Indochina, and this thing. And I sat there, and when they started talking about it again, I realized that when I was at Altus in 1962 and 63, guys were going over there then. And in part of the goings on at that particular time, they'd come back, you asked them, you know, they'd come back wearing a funny hat and be a little cocky, you know, after being shot at. You just get a special flavor about you when they shoot at you and they miss, you know. But they just simply said, we've been out crop dusting. Yeah. And the same thing when I was in Korea, guys would just disappear for a month or 2 months and come back, and the only information you got out of them was crop dusting, you know. And even the short period of time in North Dakota, guys were coming back, and where are you been? And, you know, so I guess I just looked at it was my turn to go crop dusting.
So it was vaguely being discussed, and so when they threw Southeast Asia at you, you didn't really know what to make of it.
Well, I knew that I would eventually end up over there if I stayed in the service. Yeah. You know, and so it was just kind of, it was real life, and I said, maybe if I go now, I'll get it over with, and of course, you know, the major will tell you, a lot of guys look around and look at this lapel. They say, you know, when you meet people, you look at his lapel and see who's got the bigger scorecard, you might say, and so, you know, we need some of this stuff on our shoulder, you know, to give you that extra 1% or 2%, or just to give you that extra word when somebody was writing an APR on you, know, you know, it's you know, you've been there, done that, and got the T-shirt, you know, and you fit in a lot better, you know, if you get the T-shirt than if you don't. Yeah. and you know, so it didn't seem bad. I said, if I'm going to get out, it's still a good thing to put on your resume, you know, for future events.
So you're in North Dakota, and you're at a crossroads in your life. You're thinking about the shipyards in North Carolina. They're throwing Southeast Asia on the table, and you're thinking to yourself that my service over there might give me a leg up.
That's true. And, you know, it was only a 3-month tour.
Yeah.
You know, so as soon as I didn't fight it, and then I got my orders, and, and next thing you know, the group I was with in North Dakota, because it was gonna be dissolved, they decided to have one more big fling, so they sent them all to Udorn, to Southeast Asia. They got there months before I did. Of course, I got a 707, they got a B 124. So that 124 is kind of like an SUV. You just got to stop at every gas station. There's no refueling on that sucker. You just got to get old squeaky on the ground, give them some more gas, and go again. And we had formed a detachment up there in NKP, Thailand, and we were starting to adventure north, you might say. They weren't going far north, they were just going north, and they were trying to cut.
Thailand, Bill, is where you went from North Dakota. North Dakota to Thailand. Yep.
And we were up there 7 miles from the Mekong River, which was considered the bad guys at the Mekong,
And which year was this, Bill? That you entered Thailand in 65?
April of 65.
April of 65. Okay.
And so we went over there, and like I said, that we were joined up. It was what we had with the H-43s. We had LBR, local base rescue. All the bases, air rescue kind of died after World War II, and they were trying to figure a way to survive, and they concocted this way that, and if we'd had 4-wheel drives then, we'd have probably never been air rescue, because, we had contributed something that the fire trucks didn't do. Yeah. Fire truck was basically, he could go to the end of the concrete and then a fire hose from there. Well, they come up with the 43 or the LBR. They took a fire suppression kit that weighed about 1,000 pounds, and it's got so much foam on board, and they put 2 firemen on board, and then my responsibility is when they lift the airplane up, is go up underneath the airplane, hook the fire bottle up, and they take off the attack to the engine area, where an airplane would run off the end of the runway, and if it was a fire, they could take that fire bottle and take it up close to the airplane within reason, and then they could automatically drop the bottle. Then they could back up and put 2 firemen on the ground, and then use the rotor blades to clear the way so they could get in there and suppress the fire long enough to get the pilots out, or the people in there. And this was what basically the airplane was designed to do. And it's really designed to save rescue. And in fact, rescue went under the chopping block several times. And in fact, they changed the name from ARS to ARRS, Air Rescue and Recovery Service, where we started chasing weather balloons or any job that nobody else wanted. We'd take it just to survive. And so we knew that rescue would be a need in the future. So when we got there, we basically took the LBR airplane and turned it into a combat airplane. We used a piece of coordinate steel underneath the pilot and the co-pilot seat, and we sat on our World War II flak vest in the back. And that was the way we went to war. We had one radio if we got shot down between the 4 of us, where later on they were flying with 4 radios per person. We were kind of the guinea pigs, but we had to get the job done, and we were young enough that we can do this.
And when you're there in Thailand, are you thinking to yourself, this is just going to be 3 months?
Well, yes.
Okay.
I really thought we'd be home, because the group before was over there 3 months, and they came home 3 months to a day. So, I had no reason. But then I guess the more we read and more airplanes we saw in the air, the more of this.
You kept seeing the build up.
And getting to see the build up there, and then they started talking about a new airplane. Of course, they brought on the Jolly Green Giant, which, I always tell them we were pre-green because the Jolly Green was green, and so we just refer to ourselves as pre-green, and people go, okay. We saw a lot of things going on. Our nickname for the helicopter was Pedro, but it was taken away from us because of political correctness, and so we were no name for a while, and just to make everybody happy. So I mean, all this stuff is going hand in hand as we go along.
And you're seeing the build-up, Bill, and you're thinking to yourself, this might not be 3 months.
Well, we got notification that the CH3s were coming over, and so they got there on time. But it's just like anything new, it doesn't always work according to Hoyle, you know. And this is the first time it had been pressed to test, and of course they didn't have the rescue model. In other words, we had a hoist that was mounted on the airplane for extracting people out of the jungle floor, but all they had was a cargo hoist that hung out on the side. And when they got there, like I said, they had mechanical issues that had to be dealt with, and so we were extended for the duration. And when they were able to take over, then we could go home. And they were fighting desperately to get us out of there because they didn't want us to stay 6 months, because if you stayed 180 days, then you got a PCS out of it, which means that would be a while before you had to come back. So, you know, we didn't care at that point. We're already stuck here, so let's get this 180 days out of here, and then they won't have to come back for a while. I mean, so, you know, it's all the, you know, you learn the rules, you might say, that's going on, and you say, okay, if you want to have sex with me, I'm gonna have sex with you. You know, here we go.
Well, on that note, Bill, why don't you get some water? You know, I'm just thinking, you know, what you were thinking at that time. Over in Thailand for 3 months, turned over for 6 months. Maybe the duration of this conflict that's just building up.
Well, this is one of the things that a major can tell you, that military is the most optimistic people in the world. Yeah, and we were convinced if they'd have let us do our thing, it would have been over in 3 months. This is the problem we have: is you got the most powerful military in the world that can do anything, anywhere, under any circumstances, and then you treat it like a second-class citizen. You become part of the game board in Washington, D.C. Yeah, what we saw was, in my particular case, in the beginning there was not much air defense in North Vietnam, so we could skirt in over there. And the good thing about a 105 or F4, you know, hell, you can hit it, and it's doing 400 miles an hour. You know, it can get out of the bad territory where you can get into the good territory, you know, to pick them up and bring them home, give them a beer and dust them off and send them back to work. You know, and but as they continued to build their forces, you know, we saw some of the dumb things. You know, we wouldn't let us get airborne until they had contacted a pilot on the ground. And sometimes that'd take 45 minutes to an hour. And once they talked to him, they might let us get airborne. Well, hell, we're an hour behind already before we get off the ground. The H-43 at top speed at 10,000 feet is 60 miles an hour. You know, somebody running along the ground can outrun you. You know, I mean, the air is very thin up there. You know, we started out flying at 3,700 feet. But when we started getting bullet holes in the blades, we decided, well, maybe we ought to go a little bit higher. You know, and so these were the, you know, adjustments as we go on. And I guess that we were more focused on our stuff, our part, and we just figured everybody else would do their part, and we'd get this thing over, we'd go home and have a beer and say, hell, that was a hell of a good job. But then we find out that Washington wasn't doing their part, you know. And unfortunately, at that particular time, and we would support anybody that wasn't communist, you know, and if they claimed not to be communist, then we supported them. We supported Castro, we supported Ho Chi Minh and built him to what he was, and then he changed it and turned his back on us, you know, and Castro the same way. I mean, we just have a knack for picking the losers, you might say, and you know, it's sad to say sometimes that the military is being used by the politicians as a for-profit, you know, helping their friends and build guns, bullets, and all this stuff. And you know, you sit there and say, well, why did we leave $800 billion worth of welfare? Well, we can. Look how many people we can hire to build new ones, you know. And You know, just like I said, and you know, here we are now with word about these weapons being used on our children and grandchildren. You know, and so everything points back to the bottomless pit in Washington D.C. On the, you know, they just they have no respect for us. You know, as they like to talk a good story, but when it comes down to putting leather through the road, they're just not good at it.
Yep. And so that 3 months turns into 6 months. Is it after 6 months then, Bill, when, what happened after that 6 months?
Well, I was on a rescue mission on the 20th of November 1973. This was in my, I guess I should say my due date.
Yeah.
We were flying, sometimes the C-3s would fly, and then when they weren't, maintenance-wise couldn't fly, then we flew, and that was our day.
Just
And
happened to be your day.
it happened to be my day in the barrel, you know, so.
Yep.
Again, we had the comedy of errors that I've been speaking of, you know, they wouldn't let us get off the ground, you know, wouldn't give us the coordinates because they afraid we'd leave without them, you know, and so, you know, like I said, we didn't know how much fuel to put on board, and, you know, 'cause, we were the first ones to develop in-flight refueling with helicopters. We basically did it with a 55-gallon barrel, two quick disconnects in the garden hose, and that was one of my responsibilities. Is once we'd burn off enough fuel, to hook up the garden hose to the airplane to dump the fuel into the airplane, retrieve the garden hose and the quick connect.
And that garden hose did the job, Bill?
That did the job. You know, it's a 1-inch garden hose. You know, somebody brought it over in a duffel bag or something. You know, but again, you know, this is what the military's about: getting the damn job done. Yeah. And we don't put ourselves in danger, but we don't run from it. You know, and so. So my responsibility was, once I retrieved the disconnects in the garden hose, is to keep the barrel out the back. So I probably got credit for 2 bombing runs over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel, you know. But I can imagine how you felt at 10,000 feet and you look up at this thing coming at you, you know. Yeah. It's, you know, like I said, it probably exploded when it hit the ground, but you know.
So you were on one of these rescue
missions,
and what happened then?
I saw well, we got into the area. Of course, we were above the soup, so we had to shoot down through the clouds, and that's a hairy expense with a helicopter, you know, because you're just trying to hope there's some air underneath you, not ground, you know, when you break out. And we broke out, you know, and of course we were dead track to the pilot, and they did no problem. We pulled in, and like I said, we have a hoist on board that's 100 feet long, and the last 10 feet is painted red, and I'm holding red cable, so I knew I'm about 90 feet off the ground. But unfortunately, he was on the side of a hill, so we had to get out a little bit and then swing the cable over to him. You know, it wasn't that far to swing it over to him, but still, everything is having to be done in a quick motion.
Are you going to bring him up to the helicopter?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the A-1Es on board, they were our escort, that, you know, kept the firepower from, you know, around, because they had 4 rocket pods with 15 rockets in each pod underneath their wings on 2 airplanes, and one of them took a hit in the air, a rocket pod, and caught on fire. Mm-hmm. And first of all, you know, if he'd been a good pilot, he wouldn't have asked for permission. And when he asked for permission, and of course it had to go all the way to Washington, D.C., and these are happenings pretty quick. Yeah. And the last words I heard on the air was unauthorized disposal of the ordnance in the local area. A good pilot wouldn't have heard that message. He'd have stayed there and fought the war. And so, like I said, when you're sitting there and all your support left you, and you're looking at the eyes of another American, you just don't leave. Yeah. And that's in the process of bringing him up off the ground, we got hit. And
how many people in the helicopter with you?
4.
4 people, yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the pilot and the co-pilot, myself and the paramedic. And we have a paramedic on board in case the pilot's injured. We can put him on the horse, send him down to make the necessary repairs or get him ready for hoisting to the airplane. And these are all the magic scenarios. But when we started taking hits, and the good part for us, they weren't shooting up at us. If we'd been shooting up at us, we'd been dead. But they were shooting down at us, and we got the engine, the transmission, and the rotor blades, and the head, and everything above us. And so they took most of the hits. You know, we got a few inside the airplane. You know, and one or two went through the plexiglass front, but you know, didn't hit anybody. And once they hit the engine fuel control, we just started sputtering, and next thing you know, we're chopping bamboo, and the blades on the 43 are just no match for bamboo, and we fell about 90 feet without blades, but I guess the weight and balance of the airplane kept it upright. Yeah. And the jungle floor, if we'd landed on this hard floor right here, we probably wouldn't have survived, but the jungle, the bamboo breaking and things like that, and the way the airplane was built, kind of one of the first unibodies, you might say,
Yeah.
that was built, and it absorbed all the thing, and we were able to walk away.
All four of you?
All four of us walked away. Unfortunately, when I was on my knees, and I had to get back in the airplane when the door came by, and if I'd have stayed out there any longer, I probably would have been in 2 or 3 pieces, you know. But, you know, like I said, so I had enough reaction time to get my head out of the way, and then the airplane was still running, and the rotor heads were beating against each other because they done got out of sync, and the pilot was holding the collective stick, which is a power control on it, and he was trying to shut the engine down, but it wasn't shutting down real well because the blades are still turning. So I went around and sat in the co-pilot's lap, and we have a brake on board, and I sat there and we got a hand pump on the brake, and I pumped the brake until, you know, it got the blade stopped, because it wasn't safe to exit the airplane area with that going on around you. So we got that stopped. I got the co-pilot out of the seat. He wasn't thinking very straight at that particular point, but we all got out, and we went and we were gathered down in the stream, and of course the pilot that we were trying to rescue had already come up to us and said the place was infested, we need to get the hell out of here. Of course, we knew the rules of engagement, that the military is going to come in and blow that airplane up in 30 minutes, so if we could move, we better be moving, you know. So we got away, and we standing in the creek. The other airplane was over top of us because it flew in pairs, and unfortunately we had one flare gun, and we fired the flare, and it went right up through their grades and right beside the cockpit, and nobody ever saw the flare, so they didn't know we were right underneath them. And then we pulled out our radio, which we only had 1 to 4 people, and the antenna was broke on that way, so we had no communication whatsoever. So the pilot and myself and the PJ, we stuck together. The co-pilot got separated from us, and we got about a half mile away, and we're seeking hide until darkness. And when darkness arrived, we figured we'd tread west and hopefully get somewhere we could be picked up, you know. Well, like I said, the next thing you know, the Vietnamese are surrounding us, you know, and my pilot looked at myself and Airman Black and said, "Live to fight another day." We were outnumbered about 150 to 1, and they had everything from machetes to machine guns. So, you know, we could have probably took out 2 or 3 of them, but what advantage would that have been to the war? You know, it could have created an awful death for us. So, I mean, you know, it's again, and I totally support his response. In other words, you got to know when to say when. Now, the co-pilot got separated from us, and he's on panel 2 East, line 91. So that's how close I came to the wall. And he ended up making it back, but once they captured us, they didn't know he was there, and we didn't give any information, but he made it back into Laos and was captured by the Pathet Laos over there. And He, I don't know if you heard anything of Rescue Dawn. I don't know if you, well, Rescue Dawn, that was my co-pilot. Dingley was the main character. I've never seen the movie because I prefer to remember Dwayne Martin as a special friend, and you know, and I don't like movies because they got to make a hero and they got to make a zero, and to make the hero look good, and I mean, it's factual, but it's slanted, and my pilot and I, we've talked about it. He's 91 this year, and I just turned 80, and neither one of us I've watched bits and pieces of it, but out of honor for Captain Martin, we probably never go see the scene. I have met the guy that played Dwayne in the movie and told me about his experience of creating that movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're taken prisoner, and again, Bill is the longest held enlisted POW in American history. Over 7 years you were held prisoner.
You ever take an hour or two?
Give or take an hour or two, over 7 years. Just an amazing, harrowing experience. Those 7 years are well documented. There's a book that I recommend called The Longest Rescue that's been written about Bill. And you can also find a section of this book, Honor Bound, The History of American Prisoners of War in Southeast Asia, in which there is a section on Bill.
They can Google William A. Robinson
Yes, you'll find a lot of interviews.
on YouTube, and
Yep.
so, yeah.
Is there anything, Bill, you want to share with us about those 7 years?
Well, you know, I think you know, it is simply just never give up, never give in, just roll with the punches, bounce back, get ready for the next round. And like I said, I had the opportunity to serve with some of America's finest, and you know, and they are a group of optimists, whether in Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. You know, they'd come in with the same thing we came in. The war can't last 3 more months. We'll be out of here before Christmas, and you know, that was the kind of the motto. I adopted a 3-day tour. Yesterday I was shot down, today's stay, and tomorrow I'm going home. So you know, and
Yeah,
I
I think our viewers need to hear that. I think that's so important. You took those 7 years, and to make it through that, you had this 3-day strategy.
3-day strategy, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, the main thing was to never get too high and never get too low. I mean, this is what we tried to do with each other, you know, keep us on an even keel. Most of us spent, I was very fortunate, I only spent about 8 months in solitary confinement, so some guys spent 4 years. So no matter how you can feel about yourself, you can always find somebody in a deeper bucket of manure. You know? That's, you know, and I choose to count my blessings, not my misfortunes. You know, and you know, I have had the opportunity to go back twice to Vietnam, and first time I went back and met the lady that was on the postage stamp. I met her kids, her sister, her mama, her daddy. You know, I was on everybody's mantle in Vietnam. And I went back in '95. I was a Vietnamese hero rather than an American hero. You know, saying, but I was treated like royalty by the Vietnamese. You know, I mean, as far as, and I know why they wanted something from America. You know, before I accepted that trip with the Japanese broadcast, I called my friend Pete Peterson, who was a congressman from the 2nd District of Florida, and asked him about it and, you know, what should I do? And he said he recommended I go, and so I trusted his word, and I went, and while I was there, they announced he was going to be the first ambassador to Vietnam. So he had a reason for me.
An agenda, he sure did.
Just to clear the way and find out if they're still shooting Americans, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, right. And do you remember the year that you were liberated?
1973, February 12th. You know, they came out And what led to that point is I like to tell the story about, you know, negotiations were going on. President Johnson, you know, he stood up in 1964 and lied to American people, saying, I'm not going to send the American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. In less than 2 years, he had 600,000 troops in Southeast Asia. Well, when he lost the election, or decided not to run for election, dedicated his effort to the peace that was around the corner. Piece of an arm, piece of a leg, whatever piece he was thinking about, you know. But when Nixon took over, we started Vietnamize the war. And essentially, as the Vietnamese stood up, we stood down, and eventually we got, like I said, there was about 20,000 in 1965, and by 1972, we were down to about 20,000 combat troops in Southeast Asia. And when the Vietnamese signed all the agreements, but when it came to the POW issue, they said, oh, just go in the House, we'll take care of that later. President Nixon and Kissinger said, no, we're going to take care of it now. They got up and stormed out of the meeting, and we spoke the language that everybody in the world understood. In an 11-day period starting on the 18th of December 1972, we dropped more bombs than has ever been dropped in the history of mankind. It wasn't to advance a war, but to secure the freedoms of some 591 Americans being held in captivity in North Vietnam, and South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. As a result of that action, the Vietnamese came back to the peace table. The reason that action had to be taken is because there were French prisoners that we captured at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 that did not get released until 1979. And the American people would not have allowed that to happen to their sons and daughters. And so, as a result of that, the Vietnamese came back to the peace table, and we signed an accord, and it was read to us on the 26th of January, 1973, with the first group of prisoners of war and the last group of combat troops will come out simultaneously between the 12th of February and essentially the 29th and 30th of March, 1973, and that was the ending of the Vietnam War, you know. And I always say, a friend of mine was asked during that period of time, he says, could you identify freedom? And he simply said, doors with inside knobs. And that's a real thought process, is the opportunities each and every one of us have just because he can walk up to a door and enter and adventure into the other side that was taken away from us. As I look back on it, I used a statement that, the saddest part to me, what I've seen in my 80 years here on earth, is that when we forgave those who ran before we as a nation stood up and said thank you to those who served. Another part that gets left out of that is our Canadian brothers. You know, we had a few that went to Canada, but 5 times as many Canadians came down and joined our armed forces and fought side by side with America. So that's the big lie. Me personally, only 1 out of 5 aircrew members shot down over Southeast Asia survived. So I can truly say I'm one of the luckiest men alive.
Yes.
And that's been my goal all along, to make sure that those who serve, have served, and continue to serve are never lost in the paperwork. And it's never more prevalent as the motto of the Vietnam Veterans of America, which I'm a proud member of, is never again will one generation of veterans abandon the other. I have the great most respect for World War II veterans, Korea veterans, but if they'd have stood up for us, we would not have to do what we endured. And then never so was the case in 1991 when our brothers and sisters came home, and the same group that stood up against us, the Kennedys, the Fondas, and the Careys, took the airways to criticize our sons and daughters and nieces and nephews, and the Vietnam veterans stood up and said, hell no, not again. And as a result of that, this nation has learned to separate the war from the warrior. in my generation, they had no ability. And it was, to them, if the war was bad, the warrior was bad. And because of the Vietnam veterans, we have reopened an avenue that we can honor those men and women who choose to wear our uniform and make sure that they're never caught up in the pits of war as the Vietnam veteran was. In other words, that you can disagree with the war or support the war, and it's entirely up to you. But we will always support our men and women in uniform.
Amen.
And
I
I have one closing that I use a lot when I speak is that, you know, and it's a simple saying, in this great land of ours, some people dream the dream, some people live the dream. Our armed forces defend that dream. And God bless the defenders of the dream.
Amen. That's a great place to end this interview. Again, so thankful and honored to have your story here now at the center.
Thank you.
And hope that you all will check out this interview on our YouTube channel and check out our website for other stories of veterans from our region who have served in wars and protected that dream, everybody. Thank you for your service and welcome home, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.